Good evening and welcome along to tonight's group coaching call. Thanks for joining us, Jess. Hopefully a couple other people drop in now that we're started. But tonight's presentation is on why does Coach Ray get me to train so slowly? There's a number of reasons for that, but as we get into it, there's a few questions that need to be phrased at the back of the mind during this presentation. And starting off with, what is the purpose of training? How do we measure performance? And what does it take to get better? So at the end of the day, we train to make improvements, and that is the goal of our training. Whether we want to be able to swim, bike, run, kayak, row faster or further, or just to become more efficient. It's natural to want to put in effort and get into or try and get the most out of your training, but that's not necessarily the best way to get the most out of your training. That effort that you put in needs to be managed to optimize your results. Intensity in your training is only natural. As your fitness improves, you're going to want to try and push that pace because it's natural to work on the assumption that if you're going faster than you were last week, you are therefore better than you were last week. But that's not necessarily a good measure of how your improvement is going. How do we measure that improvement? And as I touched on in the previous slide, it's easy to accept the obvious data, whether it's from your Garmin or a bike computer or from Zwift or some other, or Strava, particularly Strava segments, showing you that you've gone faster on a segment than you have previously. But if we ignore that obvious data from each training session, we can actually drill down into the focus of each particular training session and ensure that the aim of that session is achieved. Now, for a lot of those sessions, we just want to become more efficient and develop some physiological component of fitness. And for endurance athletes, we want to improve our aerobic capacity or our aerobic efficiency. And I'll get back to that shortly. Often, and I feel bad because Diane, who's in that picture there, she does not have an ego at all. I probably shouldn't have used her on the slide, but if we look at the training of many elite athletes, particularly around their social media, there's a lot of boasts about the training they're doing and how hard or challenging it is, especially in the lead up to the Ironman World Champs that occurred today in Kona for the women, or a few weeks ago in Nice, France for the men. There's certainly been some Instagram and YouTube and Facebook posts from some of those elite athletes. And it's easy for a not so elite athlete to try or want to replicate the challenge of those sessions. For us mere mortals with friends who are athletes, they too also boast about how tough their training sessions they've achieved. And sometimes we do it as well. We exaggerate what we've done for that training. The opposite of that is denying that they've even been training, but taking away the psychological games you sometimes play with some of your mates to make them think that you're faster and better than they are. The focus of our training is typically harder and faster and or longer. Elite athletes, when we look into the research around the training done by elite athletes, is the vast majority of their training is at lower intensities. About 80% of their training is done at low intensity. And there's a very good reason for that. They are building an aerobic base. And the more time they spend out training, the greater that aerobic base is, and the more efficient that aerobic engine they've got becomes. So the aerobic base is basically looking at how efficient your heart and lungs can work together to take oxygen out of the air and deliver it to the working muscles, where it's utilized in a range of biochemical processes within the muscle cells themselves, making us more efficient we can utilize that energy more efficiently so that we can grow and develop. When it's time to come and do the higher intensity sessions, we're going to develop and get better gains from those hard sessions if we've already developed a very effective aerobic base. And that's effectively the difference between an elite athlete and a recreational athlete. Now, long aerobic sessions or low intensity sessions are the key to developing this aerobic base. Arthur Lydiard was a massive proponent of developing that aerobic base, particularly back in the 1960s. He delivered a large number of both Olympic and World Championship medals through the athletes he coached. Now, he's well known for long, steady distance running, but that's not the only thing he should be known for, because he was massively into high intensity training at the appropriate stage of the build-up and for key sessions only. He wanted to make sure that all his athletes were recovered and not tired for their key sessions so that they could absolutely give it everything they had. And one of the biggest issues is that most people do their easy training far too hard, so that when it comes time to do their hard training, they don't have the energy to do it at the intensity they should be doing it at. So the key is developing that aerobic base. Now, the benefits of training slowly, or technically it's not slowly, it's at a low intensity. And down on this chart here, showing a range of intensities from low building right through to the higher end intensities. But we're down the physiological adaptations that are coming on down here. We're improving the efficiency of the heart and lungs. We're increasing the capillarization within the muscles. And what that means is the blood vessels, the capillaries that deliver that oxygen to the working muscles, they're increased, so there's more of them working their way through the muscle. So it means that the blood, or the oxygen that needs to diffuse from the blood into the muscle cell itself, doesn't need to go so far in order to do so. So we can get that oxygen into the muscle a lot easier. We also have an increase in blood volume, which means we can transport more oxygen simultaneously to get it to the working muscle more effectively. And there's also going to be an increase in oxidative and glycolytic enzymes, which basically, it's a big flash scientific word that means there's going to be more things within the muscle fiber that are going to allow this whole process to occur easily. And the last one there is increased muscle fuel storage. So when we consume some form of carbohydrate, it gets stored throughout the body in a number of ways. One of them is within the muscle as muscle glycogen, and there's going to be an increase in that. And that's all from training at a low intensity, making you a lot more efficient and effective as a result. So what's the opposite of that? At the end of the day, if you want to continue training at the intensity you choose, then that's perfectly fine. If you want to run fast, there's nothing I will do to try and physically stop you. But at the end of the day, you're not going to get the optimization of your training or performance to be as successful as you potentially could be. You're probably still going to enjoy your running. You're still going to enjoy your training, cycling, swimming, kayaking, rowing, whatever the sport of choice is. You're just not going to be able to reach your potential. And to do so, you need to maximize your time at the appropriate intensities by building that aerobic base initially. As I sort of touched on before, the other thing that occurs from running too fast is that you're going to take longer to recover prior to your next session, where you may not be able to achieve the intensity that you need to get the most out of the speed work from that. So being fresh for all the hard sessions is probably the most important part of this whole process. And you need to make sure you take your easy days easy. Now, in Matt Fitzgerald's 80-20 running book, he talks about one of the athletes he coaches called Juan Carlos, who sends him an email about wanting to improve his 10K time from 50 to 30. Now, he complains that he can barely run 8:45 per mile, which for those of us in the metric world is about 5:30 minutes per kilometre, and implies that he used to be able to do that comfortably. Matt replies to him explaining that at this stage of his build-up, he doesn't need to be doing 8:45 per mile, except in his specific sessions where they're trying to put intensity into his training. Running at that pace provides very little value to him as an athlete, and isn't really following the training plan. A more appropriate pace for him to be running at is the 9:30 per mile, which is about 6 minutes per kilometre for most of his session. And Matt goes on to say 4 out of 5 runs conducted should be at that lower intensity, that slower pace. Why do you struggle to train so slowly? And most people basically feel comfortable running at a pace that is familiar to them. And if they just go out and constantly run at the same pace, that pace becomes very familiar. And in that 80-20 running book, Matt Fitzgerald suggests that if a runner was to go for a run without their watch, they'd settle into the pace very close to a pace that they did on their previous easy run, and the one before that, and the one before that, and the one before that, pretty much because that is what you're familiar with. When you train at an intensity that's high, that becomes your habitual intensity, and that is what is slowing you down, or slowing down your improvement. It's not necessarily slowing you down, but your improvement is hindered as a result of the fact that you are training too hard and not getting the recovery between, and therefore not doing your faster workouts optimally. You do that because it feels natural, and your stride has become very familiar through experience, because that's what you are doing day in and day out. Slowing down in training. I personally, as a coach, find myself giving some very similar advice as Matt Fitzgerald gave to a number of my athletes. And that's one of the reasons I'm putting this presentation on today. It's putting the brakes on the intensity that the athletes are training at. I often find myself writing comments within people's training peaks or training tilt, advising them to hold on to those reins and pull back on that intensity and not train so hard or train so fast, and that they need to hold back a little bit. Note that this is training intensity and it's not racing intensity. Racing intensity is a totally different kettle of fish. I don't usually tell people to hold back on the reins when they're racing. I often encourage them to race as hard as they can. I might give some specifics in order to pace themselves appropriately. Starting off, I'll usually use a rule of thirds in relation to that. The first third of a race at a slightly held back pace, the second third of the event at a slightly faster pace, and then the final third at the fastest pace. Now, Jess, you will notice that in 2 weeks' time at the 11K event at the Auckland Marathon that you're running, I've already got into training peaks and put in a bit of a race plan and some specific power goals for you to try and run at for that race. But basically, I'll split that into 4Ks, and then the final 3Ks. So if you follow that first 8K plan and you're feeling really fresh for the final 3Ks, go faster than what I've got prescribed.
Yep, thank you.
The final part there, that is where the success of a training program or plan is actually measured, is at the race, not by doing your best performance out on the training track. It's about getting to the race and performing to the best of your ability. So in summary, we're trying to develop your aerobic efficiency and build that aerobic base. Training intensity and racing pace are two different things, and we're not trying to race when we're training, and vice versa. And the last one there, fast training is planned for specific sessions, not every session. So it's only about 20% of the time we are actually trying to train as fast as possible. Any questions?
No.
Anything from you, Annie? I think you're on mute there, Annie.
Sorry about that. Sorry,
That's all right.
you might have covered this off in the first part, but so when you're talking about building the aerobic base, I guess that never stops, does it? The base just climbs as you get fitter. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, it does.
Yeah.
And it also depends on what you're training for as well. So for someone, if we just keep a comparison for a runner, if someone's training for a 1,500 meter running race, their aerobic base doesn't need to be as high as it does for someone running a marathon. A marathon's going to take a lot longer, and they need that much larger aerobic base. Having said that, they need a very high VO2 max. So there's going to be a disproportionate balance between, or contrasting balance between what we're trying to do with both those athletes trying to compete at each end of the spectrum. To be an elite 1,500 meter runner, you're going to need a very good aerobic base, but you're also going to need a very, very high VO2 max. For the typical recreational endurance athlete who is doing a half marathon in the winter, doing a triathlon or 3 in the summer, the more efficient, the more effective that aerobic base is, the better the recovery from those events is going to be, and the greater the potential for your performance in those is also going to develop. You're going to be fitter, you're going to get more enjoyment out of your sport as well, and you'll recover from the hard training a lot more efficiently and effectively.
Oh, that was my only question.
Perfect. Oh, in that case, we'll wrap up the presentation side of the coaching call, and then we will go into questions about your training and racing coming up.